Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another discussion with the Unerased Book Club. We are here tonight with Fatima Haque to facilitate a discussion on How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy by Jenny Odell. Before we get started, I'd like us to briefly introduce ourselves. I'll start. My name is Lucy, and I am a library tech in the youth department. I do a lot of programming, youth programming, and then a lot of book discussions as well.
Hi, I'm Lauren, and I work on the desk staff at the Ann Arbor District Library.
I was trying to see which Elizabeth should go first. My name is Elizabeth, and I am a librarian at AADL. I am in the youth department, but I also purchase all of the adult fiction and books on CD that we offer. And I'm an avid reader, and I enjoy doing a lot of book discussions as well, many of them with Lucy and the rest of you.
I'm Elizabeth as well, and I work as a library technician in the archives.
Hi everyone, I'm Fatima Haque. I am a co-facilitator of the Unerased Book Club. We read Asian American literature and try to build community through that. So we are a nationwide group book club, and anyone can join us for discussions. Our book club is also sponsored by Rising Voices, which is a Michigan-based nonprofit supporting Asian American women and families, particularly in electoral spaces. And I'm happy to share more details about that with anyone who's interested. I'm really excited to talk about this book, and I'd love to just get us going with a question about what did you think? How did you receive this book?
I can start. I was really excited to read this. I originally read it somewhat earlier during the COVID-19 pandemic when I was struggling with doing nothing because there wasn't much to do. So I was excited to read it in some ways just because I found myself spending a lot of time on my phone and just kind of scrolling through things and just feeling like the stress of everything had affected my attention span, whatever. I'm sure many of us can relate to that. And I ended up really enjoying it. I found it much denser than I had expected. So it took me a long time to get through, actually, but I kind of embraced it and just read it sort of slowly. And I actually ended up like rereading passages quite a bit, just to kind of like really make sure I was taking the points that that Jenny Odell was making. And I ended up enjoying it a lot, and I'm looking forward to talking more about some of the details of it as we get into the discussion.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Elizabeth said. I felt like this book is it's timely, right? And that the title is How to Do Nothing, and I feel like that is difficult to do. And it's weird to feel like, by doing nothing, you're actually doing something, right? That's laid out pretty quickly by Jenny Odell in the introduction. And I felt like this book also it had some real meat to it, really, really rich stuff, especially in the beginning. I really loved the introduction and found myself wanting to reread that because of just there's a lot to unpack, I think, there, and we could spend a lot of time talking. I'm excited to hear everyone else's thoughts about it. But yeah, I think that this idea that we live in a society that really values certain things very well and encourages certain behaviors and discourages others, and that the work to do nothing is a real act of will. That's a really powerful message, and I thought it was a great book. I'm just glad I got to read it.
I also enjoyed it. I've been wanting to read it for quite a while. And as I was reading it, I made a lot of notes. We discussed it before we started recording that a lot of us made a bunch of notes and marked a lot of pages that we thought were important. And there's, like we've said, there's a lot going on. She has a lot to say, a lot of well laid out arguments with a lot of different examples, from anything from philosophy to art practice and science. So yeah, as I was reading it, I was struck by how timely it is, like Lauren said, but also how much has changed in the short amount of time since it was published, especially with COVID, but other stuff as well. She talks a lot about environmental disasters. Obviously, those are increasing. And she talks about a lot of stuff with like market value of art. And I was like, what about NFTs? Like, I wonder what she would say about that. Like, there are just so many moments in there where I'm like relating it to current events and like, what would she think about this? So I'm excited to also talk more about it.
Yeah, I was also really excited to read it. It had been something I wanted to read for a while. And like Elizabeth Pierce said, I was struck by how dense it was. Like it took a while to get through, but I also think that's because I found myself so focused on each new point she was making. And I loved how much I learned from this book about, like Elizabeth Smith was saying, like art and philosophy and all, there's this whole piece on like these performance artists that I thought was amazing. And I found myself doing more research on them. And so there were a lot of different points here where I felt like I was making connections with other things that I was reading and consuming in my life. And it was interesting to try and put them in a different context because of the way she laid them out. So there's a lot in here. And like everyone else, I'm excited to discuss it.
Yeah, when I first started reading this book, it was actually over a year ago. And I was also taken aback by how dense it was. It doesn't feel like a book for general audiences. However, the topic is so timely that it does feel like it's something we need. It's a very important book in that way. The subject is also really close to my heart because this is something I try to teach at U of M in my class on leadership. And so I actually spend a lot of time talking about the importance of solitude in leadership. And my students, as part of their classwork, have to do contemplative or practices. So each week they get journaling prompts, and they're encouraged to do a mindfulness activity, whether that's a mindful walk, a mindful listening, like conversation, mindful eating, or just breath meditation. And a lot of the things that she brings up about our feeling and needing to do something, and to always be productive in a very particular way comes up. That is what students write about in their weekly reflections from my class. And over again, I hear, this feels so stupid. I feel like I'm wasting my time. Even though I know this is a class assignment, I feel like I am not doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and come up against a lot of resistances. And so what you said, Lauren, about her point of this being an act of will, I wanted to kind of start the conversation about, like, why is this an act of will, like doing nothing or allowing ourselves to have solitude? Why is that such a strong act of will, and what makes it so?
I think our culture privileges something that is monetarily productive or productive in some way. I guess like when I was in grad school, I would feel guilty for trying to like work out or make myself food. And it's like, our culture privileges completely degrading your body over being productive, whatever that means, like whether or not it actually is productive. Like, I don't know. Yeah, I just see this trend to like sacrifice your health. And that was another thing that kind of stood out to me, is like the COVID outbreak and how we momentarily were like, we do care about people's health. And then at some point it becomes, well, this is a risk everyone's going to have to take, and we just have to get back to normal.
I think there can also be a lot of like personal guilt if you're taking time for yourself, like Elizabeth was saying, you know, this, I experience this a lot. Like if I would like to take like a contemplative walk or even just sit and like, you know, just kind of try to empty my mind a bit. I'm like, I should be cleaning the toilet. I should be vacuuming. I should be like pulling up the weeds in the yard. I mean, I just think it's we're conditioned to emphasize productivity. You know, whether it's monetarily or, you know, with just concrete things that you can see that you're accomplishing. And so it is in many ways, I mean, I completely agreed with the author. It is an act of will to say like, no. And I think also it's a bit of a retraining of your mind. If you're someone who like me feels this guilt, you have to really say, well, no, this is as important as other things that might be happening, is, you know, meditative space or doing nothing or whatever.
Yeah, I think her idea of like the detaching and then re-engaging was really helpful for me to think about, because it's not like you're not just saying I'm doing nothing. I mean, you are in the context of what we think of doing something is, but you're re-engaging with different things, whether that's deep listening or, you know, a contemplative walk or just creating, I mean, observing art and putting it in different context. But I really liked that sort of like detach and then re-engage. I think that was a helpful framework.
I think it's kind of also, it's like a trap. You're not doing nothing to go back and do more something that's like benefiting the capitalist machine. It's like you're resting and you're not resting to recharge to go back and continue doing that. It's like you're trying to reframe your entire approach to your existence and your relation to the community.
Yeah, that's actually a very common response I see in the students as well, right? So when they write, they're like, oh yeah, and I went back to my work and I felt so refreshed and I got all the stuff done. And I do have to in some way sell it as this, right? Like you participate in contemplative activities in order to be more restored and in order to do this. And I bring out research talking about how students who participate in it have like lower stress, lower test anxiety, you know, like those types of things in order to have them buy into it. But it is me still having to operate within that capitalist framework where we do it in service to productivity, not because we want to completely detach.
Yeah, I want to pick up on what Elizabeth was saying about reframing, and that notion of, I don't think Jenny Odell writes about it in How to Do Nothing, but I listened to a podcast where she was interviewed about this book. And she brought up Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, which is one of my personal favorite short stories of all time. And Bartleby is this kind of like law clerk, a lowly, like copyist kind of a guy. At one day he's working in a law office and the lawyer just asks him to, Bartleby, will you copy this out? And he just responds by saying, I prefer not to. So there's not like a no or a yes. I feel like our society does present us with binary choices a lot of the times. And I think Jenny Odell seems to be getting at this idea of trying to reframe. What exactly am I trying to do with my life? I don't need to say yes or no to this binary choice that's offered to me. There might be something else. And I'm interested what Lucy said, like you're not just detaching and just, I don't know, walking off into the sunset. The point is to be present, but how and on what terms? Yours? What are those terms? I also just want to point out, because Elizabeth Smith brought this up too, about COVID and this time of we're we had this brief period where it seemed as if our culture agreed that essential workers mattered and health mattered and everyone's lives mattered. And that sort of got lost, right? And there's a sort of like cultural shift that happened somewhere between now and back in March 2020, when it was like, no, we need to go back to work, right? I think that it's really hard to truly like make a huge shift because it would require seeing people in a fuller dimension than our culture tends to.
Yeah, I love this idea of creating third options and stepping away from the binary. I think she does a good job of that. She does mention Scrivener in the book as well. And I just remember thinking, like, I hadn't read that particular story, and just this idea of this person continuously saying I would prefer not to. And the idea of preference as well is super interesting, because it is not questioning, as she argues, it's not a direct no, which you can fight against. It's just a preference, right? So if I say no, I'm resisting, then okay, you're resisting, say, arrest. And so I take you away, right? Like that's something I can take action against, but this whole preference piece of it is not. And then I think it's also interesting that she talks about Rebecca Solnit's work about communities that came after disasters and came together, which in times of crisis, and we see that we saw that during COVID times, but I don't know if all the elements of connection existed at such a large scale that we were able to sustain it. And one of the questions that I left with was, what does it take to sustain such a connection developed during a time of crisis, right? When communities do come together, is that something that lasts, or is it something that dissipates with time?
Well, I think that you need to cultivate it. And that's kind of a message that comes up again and again in this book. And Lucy brought up the avant-garde, like I think like artists, and how Jenny Odell at one point talks about John Cage and among other people. But she talks about that particular a piece by John Cage. It's very famous. I forget what the title is, but it's a demarcation of time, right? X number of minutes, X number of seconds, where the performer sits at the piano and seemingly does right nothing. But when you're in the audience in a theater or watching this, a concert hall, you're hearing all kinds of things. And Jenny Odell mentions how that piece being performed inspired her. When she left the hall, she heard the cacophony of whatever urban sounds in a different way, and they seemed to matter more. She noticed more, was the gist, I think, of that anecdote. And that stuck with me, because I think that, like, we don't get to listen to a performance or experience a piece of art that inspires us every single day. So what are we doing as individuals to kind of cultivate that sense of noticing more? And I really, really appreciated that, message that I think is a main one of this book, How to Do Nothing, is really like, you do need to work at this, because this is not given to you. And I think to your question, Fatima, like, how come that goes away? How come that seems to happen like at the beginning of a crisis, a community rallies around and really seems to dial into what matters? And then why does that like go away? Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that it's hard work. It's actually really hard.
I think in terms of the recent movements that have been kind of happening around COVID. I would say the attention economy has something to do with it. Like there's so much information swirling around out there. Companies trying to get people back to work at all costs, exploiting people, and just like taking up all the time that we once had to think about all these things. Like for some people, COVID was probably the first time, if they had that privilege to be home, that they were able to do that, while other people were forced to work and put their lives on the line every day.
I want to say a little more to that, to what Elizabeth just said, but I also want to give other people space to answer and say things. I guess I just want to say quickly that I think that, that's a really interesting problem is, and I think I can extrapolate, even though this book was written right in like 2019, I can extrapolate from what Jenny Odell said in it about how she mentions, I think several times, at least one time significantly, where it's like, hey, if you have the luxury to read this book and think about these questions, you're already sitting with quite a lot of privilege. So I am acknowledging this as the author of this text. I thought that was very, I just thought that was very honest of her and direct. And the fact that we're sitting here talking is, obviously we're sitting here with a lot of privilege, getting to, just mull this over. And as Elizabeth Smith just said, like maybe the pandemic was the first time that some people were given the luxury of staying home, staying safe, and exploring maybe things that they just didn't have the time to do, before. My suspicion is that I don't think too many people got to do that, and that's gone away for a lot of people, and myself included. It's hard to like get back to that feeling of, whoa, what am I going to do today, and also feel comfort at the base of it, that my creature comforts, my immediate needs are taken care of. I'm safe. I'm okay. And anyway, I just wanted to react to that. I thought that was a really good point.
I also think within the context of like people having opportunities to maybe do nothing, or not do nothing, but have time at home that they hadn't had during the pandemic, especially in the beginning, there was also this sort of wave of like, oh my gosh, I have time, I'm going to, and then this list of like, I'm going to learn to knit, I'm going to learn to bake, and you could see that with like the bread baking, and so it's like we couldn't, as a culture, people who did have the luxury of time couldn't detach. They had to make things, and there was like so much of that, so that there's a sense of like, well, I'm not making anything, am I being productive? This book would have been like a helpful guideline for, I wish I'd read it at the beginning of all of this, just the idea of how you detach. And it was interesting, if you think about our culture, that even given time to detach, people couldn't stop producing.
Yeah, that cycle is super interesting. And now we can collectively say we've all experienced it to a degree, right? For me, what was really interesting about that is that, people had that hyper productivity, let's bake, let's knit, let's do whatever for a short period of time. And then there was like an apathy that hit, at least for me, right? Where it's just like, I'm just now tired. And there's still a lot of work to be done, and I'm exhausted, and I miss the way life used to be, and I miss having balance, and there are all these things. And I didn't quite know how to shift away from that or to feel those things, and like if to have that proper detachment. And I wonder with this book too, like her whole idea of because I don't think what we did, the empathetic part of it is not really resisting, right? It's not resisting the attention economy. It's kind of just caving into it until we have enough energy to like rise back up a little and okay, I still have stuff to do, so I'm gonna go do it, right? But it is not the rest. And I think that pause that she's Odell is talking about, the detachment, that is about resting slightly so you can look at a different frame of the picture, which I thought was super interesting. And how she gets there are all those things of noticing and observing and being in the moment and staying with something. I'm curious what folks thought. So one of my favorite chapters in this book was about the impossibility of retreat. I was so taken by all the history that was presented there of people, and in different time periods, in different locations, giving up on civilization. And I know that this is also a very timely conversation because of things like things we're learning about Facebook and Instagram and the effect or the impact it had on everything from elections to mental health, particularly of teenagers and everything else. And I think a lot of people are grappling with this idea of what do we do? Do we just like get off these platforms? Or do we do something else? So I'd love to hear what folks thought about that chapter.
I also loved that chapter, found it really interesting. Chuckled at the imagery of the guy in the like costume, like talking for 45 minutes while people are just kind of like the Burning Man enthusiast. Yeah. But I also, I think because there is so much technology in particular these days, like it can be, I think many of us feel the need to set limits with it. But I think in some ways that almost, because I know certain people who do things like have a time of day that they check their email, like in the morning and in the evening, or they go on social media at a certain time, and that's kind of their limit that they impose on themselves, or they like read the news for 15 minutes in the morning, and then that's, a lot of people put limits on that. And I guess I find like that still doesn't seem like resisting the attention economy to me. It just seems like basically just like putting a limit on it, but you still know that like, okay, well, later tonight I'm going to check my email, or like, I know I'm going to get up tomorrow and read the news. And then I almost think like in the times that I've tried that, it's almost made me a little more like focused on it and stressed, because I know at a certain time I'm doing that thing. Anyway, I just, that was my comment on that, just because I feel like, and I think sometimes the only way, this was my final point, is to do something where it's just almost like, no, for this period of time, it's just no. And I know that's not practical for many of us in daily life, but to just say like, I'm not engaging with this for X amount of time. And maybe you can't set a limit specifically, I don't know, but that it's a bit, I'm always like, so I never speak as well as everyone else in these, but hopefully you take my point and it's just, but I think sometimes it's just the only answer is to just cut everything out, not have these like specific limits. I don't know.
You're in good company, Elizabeth. definitely. I feel like why did I just say that about 5 times per discussion? But what you brought up just now reminded me of a graphic that I really love. I don't know if you can really see it. It probably won't let me because of my, weird blur. But it says, I didn't check email today. And then at the bottom, it says, I don't think I'll check it tomorrow. And then it says, there's an exhortation and it says, let's take control of our lives and live for pleasure, not pain. And I really love this graphic. It's kind of funny. I think I find humor in it. Someone just lounging luxuriously, forgetting their email for a day or purposefully not looking at it. And I don't know, I guess it's complicated, as I think you were getting at, Elizabeth. It's and Fatima, you asked about retreat and this notion of that word. What does it mean to retreat, or is it useful to retreat? And what my takeaway from that chapter, which I agree with you all, was a pretty strong chapter. I learned a lot. It's really cool. One was kind of pointing out that these attempts, by various people, but one really struck me was in the United States in the 60s, setting up communes, deciding to go totally off the grid, away, become self-sufficient, almost always kind of fizzled out, right? And why? Well, I don't want to put words in Jenny Odell's mouth because I can't really remember what the big takeaway she had was from all this, but what I took from it was this idea that if you're just that's almost putting up that negative, saying no, right? Being no, just a hard no, I'm not going to do anything ever, have anything to do with this culture. And, first of all, yes, again, that's not an option that many people have. So that approach is not, I don't know what the word is, scalable or whatever. But for many, but it's just not accessible. That's out of reach. But also it just didn't work. Why? And I think that for me, it had to do with a sort of attitudinal baseline approach to how this is going to work. And I felt it was almost even though in our minds oh, a commune, that's so imaginative, that's so amazing, it betrayed a lack of imagination. It betrayed a real lack of open-endedness. And I think also I'm curious to know what others think, if anything, about this, because something is missing here, is sort of what, and maybe it could be that retreating outright doesn't do you or the greater good, the greater world much. It doesn't help.
I guess the way I interpret.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in undergraduate school, I studied a lot of philosophy, and I feel like that plays a big role in her arguments. So I liked the tie-in between the philosophical argument of basically a utopian society is what these communes are going for. In the 60s particularly, they were just so ahistorical. They didn't know what was going on. There is a whole established history of this all throughout human history. Humans have always done this. This is an urge humans clearly have to just retreat and create their own society. But the society is a mirror of the culture they're coming from, and they're kind of just reiterating all of the stuff that they're trying to get rid of, escape from, and having the same conflict they would have out in the regular world, but just a smaller government. People are gonna disagree on how to run things, and they don't really have an established governmental system. So I think it's trying to skirt around that, when in reality you can't really have that, because humans are constantly negotiating and interacting with each other. And I think that's kind of a larger point throughout the book, is that we are constantly interacting with our communities and our environments, and that's what she's saying we should do. We should pay attention to these things. One of the most interesting examples of retreat, I think, was she's talking about like the tech industry and all of the billionaires trying to fight their way into space. And that's kind of like the ultimate example of retreat, like just abandoning Earth and leaving it behind. And I made a note, like, it's kind of posited as this thing like a heroic act of singularity, when in reality it's based on this whole complex scientific past of people making these discoveries. So it's not like one person invented a spaceship, yet people like Jeff Bezos are like, I invented space travel and now we're saving the Earth and leaving Earth. So I just thought that was interesting. And I also was like, I wonder what she would think about that now that the space race is kind of expanded. And yeah, that was what I took away from the retreat.
Well, I think that, like, especially the space race, or what you're saying, is also a good example of how retreat doesn't really help, because it's not helping anybody or anything that you're retreating from. You know, it's like, well, I don't like this, I'm going to escape. But she has this idea at the end of the chapter of just standing apart, and she says, there's this line that I really like. She says, it means not fleeing your enemy, but knowing your enemy, which turns out not to be the world, but the channels through which you encounter it day to day. So it's like you have to stay where you are, but shift how you are interacting with the world. So the retreat in a way becomes just, it's almost like a mindset of your, like, well, that's why standing apart is really a better way to say it. But I think it's just interesting to think about maybe why retreat doesn't work, is because you're just moving the same thing somewhere else and leaving everybody else behind.
Yeah, I love all the examples she gave of resisting in place, which is the next chapter. And the one that really stood out to me was the performance artist in a busy office environment doing nothing, or seemingly doing nothing, and the chaos that kind of forms around it because people immediately take note, right? This artist sits and stares out the window and says she's an intern, she's just thinking, and or takes the escalator up and down, and this it triggers a flurry of emails by concerned folks who are like, what is happening? This person is doing something very strange. And I have been thinking a lot about how do we resist in place in so many situations, whether it's like we have complex family dynamics where everybody's like, the patterns that we see is so much the same. And if I wanted to be the person who precipitates change in that, how do I resist in place there? And at the same time, it's like in my own personal routine, you know, like I feel like I'm constantly a cog in the machine and I'm just doing, and it's an endless cycle. Like, how do I resist in place there? So I've been asking myself this question in all these different scenarios, and I'm really curious, like how other people are resisting in place, or what attempts you've made to do nothing.
I just want to, well, I'll try to react and respond to that question, Fatima. I mean, this is, yeah, it seems to be helpful to Odell to acquaint yourself with place, period. To resist in place, first of all, means, I think, what I got out of this book was, you know, try to spend some time in your surroundings a little bit more. I think that Jenny Odell is at her strongest in this book when she's describing just sort of the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area, where she grew up and currently lives, and talking about the weird spaces that still like somehow have just been off her radar forever since she was a kid, and she decided to, you know, explore, go beyond the chain link fence and look at the riverbed that was mostly cemented over, and just explore where does this go, or like, what about there's a beautiful rose garden in Oakland, California, that she starts off in the book, I think, talking about this amazing rose garden, and she comes to learn that it is all volunteer. Lots of volunteers like give of their time freely to cultivate the roses and just make sure it's a super beautiful place, not to mention fight off developers who want to just turn it into another condominium instead of this amazing space. And I've had the good fortune to be in that place before, so I really found myself like just loving her description of this place. But it made me just remember that, like, slowing down and being in those places I didn't go there very often because it was a little out of the way and a little bit, it took some extra time. And I think that one way to begin to resist in place would be to, you know, I think we're encouraged to retreat all the time, to retreat from our place. That's sort of the default, like just retreat into the metaverse if we can't afford to go to Mars with Jeff Bezos, you know, like, but we can do, there's all sorts of encouragements of just inducements to get away from who you are and not really just get distracted by the next thing. If you're me, just fall down that rabbit hole instead of wake up and walk around or explore your environment. So I feel like that's a key. I don't know if that's a big answer, but that's a partial answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that like what you're saying, Lauren, about knowing your place too she gives examples of how that can even be on a smaller scale. And that's a good way to even start like resisting in place, but just to, you know, like, what are the trees that I pass when I'm walking in my neighborhood? You know, she's a big avid bird watcher, so she's paying attention to bird song and seeing birds, but like, how much do you know about all the details of the very place you exist in? And I coincidentally happened to be listening to Braiding Sweetgrass at the same time that I was reading this book. I didn't know that they were going to like mesh so neatly, but it really hammered home that idea of bioregionalism and just made me think like, I have so much to learn, starting, you know, really small right around where I am and then going out. So yeah, I liked that idea about really learning, staying in place and connecting with your place.
I also related pretty strongly to that, like the environmentalist aspect of it, because in the past couple of years, I got my first house. So I have a backyard and I'm like trying to make all these decisions about what I want to do with it. I've lived in this region my whole life, but I didn't really know a whole lot about the plant life. Like I saw it every day, it's there. I didn't know what what all the invasive species were. Not that I could ever know everything, but like it is a constant process where you're like willfully facing your attention onto this thing that you never once thought about before. Like you're like, yeah, that's a plant, whatever, it's out there doing its thing. There may be some bees out there, but yeah, it's like definitely a different mental experience to seek that information out just in your daily life. Like, I'm on a walk, I wonder what that is, I haven't seen that before, but at the same time rely on my technology to identify what this is, because like, yeah, you use your phone app to identify stuff. So I've been trying to research, learn about the regional history, and I also worked with a local community, Ann Arbor Adapt, to install native plant gardens, and I'm trying to do stuff that's more taboo, like not raking my leaves and not mowing my entire yard. And so that's where kind of like community engagement comes in, because sometimes your neighbors aren't going to be happy about that and they're going to come tell you about it. So then you're in the position of having to like relay all this stuff that you've collected, all this information, and share it with people, which is fun.
Yeah, well, this is Ann Arbor though, Elizabeth, so you can just get yourself one of those signs that says, this is a protected nature preserve. I'm intentionally letting my grass grow long or whatever.
Well, I
Only if
technically
you
am
don't
in
have an
IPSI,
HOA.
so
Oh,
IPSI has a little, I think maybe a little bit ways to go before it's accepted fully, but
got it.
there's definitely a
Only-
movement.
Only if you don't have an HOA.
Definitely don't have that. But yeah, I've heard that it's a huge issue for some people. Some of my friends can't plant anything they want, basically.
Elizabeth Pierce, wanted to say something?
I did. I was just thinking about the like performance piece, Fatima, that you brought up, and the intern who's just staring, and like people are disturbed because that's not like what the expectation is, right? And people are confused, like and concerned. And I was just thinking about, I think you had originally asked or someone brought up like ways that we might be resisting in place. And I agree with everyone about the sense of place thing, but I was thinking that one thing that I have been like really proud of myself in the past year is I've finally admitted that I don't like to get up early. And I think that in the world, there's a lot of pressure. Like, I really think that people who get up very early are seen as like more productive and like, more. And, if you happen to like be up at midnight, people are like, oh my God, I go to bed at 9 o'clock. Like, you're crazy, and I think it's just interesting. And finally I was like, I don't like that at all. Like, I would prefer to like get up at 8:30 and probably go for like a walk or a run and get to work at 10. And I'm happy to stay until 6 o'clock. Like, that just works for me more. And like, maybe I'm not available exactly when other folks are in the morning, or maybe I don't see my email first thing. I might be answering emails later than other people, but like, that's what brings me some peace. And I just think little things like that can be a bit also resisting the attention economy, and also resisting in the place. I know it's not as much of a sense of place as everyone was talking about, but just in your place in the sense of like in your life, like, I don't know. So
Yeah.
I was just thinking about that a little bit, and when the question first came up.
I think that's an excellent example of resisting in place, because one, you had to become aware of what the place is, right? Where like the context, how waking up early is received by other people, how you feel about it. Like, that's your awareness, your bioregionalism in a sense of the situation. And I was also thinking a lot about how like I love this idea of going back into nature and doing it, but the thought of learning a lot of new names and a lot of new places and doing that is exhausting to me. It feels like another task on my to-do list that would actually feel like this is going to be a much harder risk. So for me, and what I've been doing and what I try to teach my students through the contemplative practices is can I familiarize myself with the context of my mind, right? So when we're doing a breath meditation and thoughts come up, like, can I actually just let them float across, as opposed to, or just say, that's a critical thought, that's the anxiety thought, or that's a, worrisome thought, whatever it is, and let that pass by, and still do the thing that I'm trying to do right here, which is this contemplative practice. And I think that knowing our internal context, the interiority of how we are, that goes a long way towards finding out what it is that we're trying to replace it with, right? So this idea of detachment and re-engagement, well, how can I figure out how I want to re-engage if I don't know how I'm feeling right now? And I don't think that, I think that one of the things I liked about this book is that it's not prescriptive in any particular way. What it's trying to do is show us how to find out our own re-engagement strategy and what we value, what we care about, as opposed to like prescribing like, oh, everybody should care about building community and protecting the environment and appreciating art, whatever the case may be. Yeah.
I couldn't agree with that more. And I think it is about knowing yourself too. And, maybe, Elizabeth Smith, it's exciting and calming for her to learn about native plants and put them in her yard. And that's like a way that, makes you, Elizabeth, feel a particular way, or, but I think also like it would be just as fair to just like wander down the street, letting like Fatima said, like having thoughts come into your mind and like, oh, there's that yellow bird that I see every day. Don't really know what it is, but like, that's not like what I personally like, what brings me kind of what feels true to like myself. And I appreciated that too in the book, that she never said like, here's the steps for doing the things, there was some personal, a lot of personal choice in it and just suggestions.
Yeah, and this takes time. I mean, I don't have a good answer, that like, how do you resist in place? Because I think I'm still trying to figure it out, and I think that, right, if there's, and I do love that this is not a really prescriptive book, in that like, all right, we're going to show you how to break it down in your head. You're going to learn to be that blue sky and be able to experience all the emotions, and it's all going to be gravy, and your life is going to be totally balanced. Like, no. But listening to you all speak about this, I do think like there's just one maybe other element to it is curiosity. And being able to be open to curiosity rather than closed off to like, I know how to do this and I'm on autopilot, is another piece of it. And I think that's why art is a touchstone in this book for Odell. And I can relate to that feeling of like art takes us out of the comfort zone. The intern performance art is a good example too. All right, of just being like, what is happening here? And sometimes when we have the luck to just encounter that in our everyday life, whether that's through conversations that meander into different territory that's unexpected, or you get that flash of like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling this emotion so intensely, and where is this coming from? I just need to take a moment, rather than just react or grasp or do the usual thing that you do. And so, yeah, that curiosity, rather than feeling like I've got to sit here and meditate, that's just how that doesn't work. And like, I think the more I find myself kind of like trying to build a system, the more it just breaks. And so like an element of this is being flexible too, curious, flexible, is a part of this, and summoning that always new like is hard to do. It's not encouraged in our culture.
Yeah, I think she touches on that, because what you were saying, Lauren, was making me think about, she has a quote in here from David Foster Wallace, and he talks about like going to the like he has to make a conscious decision about what to pay attention to, as far as like if you go to the grocery store and you're not making a conscious decision about what to pay attention to, like you're going to make yourself miserable, and you're going to make yourself closed off. And so he is talking about like, as far as encountering people, being more open. And that's like, she has this whole ecology of strangers, but I do think it did make me think about like going through daily life, like, am I open to like any interruption, anything, or is it's just like, is this constant, no, I've got to get through this. My routine has to stick to what it is. I've got to be closed down. So it's almost like curiosity is a big part of it. Like you're saying, you have to be almost conscious of turning your curiosity on and being curious about things that you might not think you're curious about. And that sounds weird, but it's like being open to things that you don't even think you're being closed to, that's a hard place to get, right? But yeah.
To that point, I think kids are a really amazing way of achieving that. I have 3 nibblings, 2 boys and a girl, and and they all have different interests. And I don't care about video games. I don't care about, a lot of different things, but I found myself being curious about them as people. So I do try to engage them in that. And I actually find myself like, oh, this is actually really interesting in all these ways. And so that's one example like that was coming to my mind, Lucy, as you were talking about, like, how do you be curious about something you're not curious about or stay open to it? I think for me, it's been, can I get in touch with like another core thing? Like maybe I really value, well, in this case, I really value knowing my nibblings and familiarizing myself with them and having a relationship with them. And that's what guides me into it, not this vehicle of video games.
I love that point that like, and of course kids are an amazing example, but I think there's other ways to find curiosity about things too that you wouldn't automatically necessarily gravitate towards, but in looking at and hopefully training your mind a little bit to be able to look at things in different lights. Kind of like, again, Elizabeth Smith said with your yard, like you weren't necessarily always super interested in like native plants, but then you got a yard and that became something that you wanted to like pursue and learn about in that way, and I just think it's a great practice to not shut down about things that we don't naturally gravitate towards, but try to find new ways to engage with them that maybe wouldn't be our first instinct.
I feel like she gets to that a lot in her like I thou argument. Like you're constantly looking at, if you're constantly looking at people as a source of gain for yourself, then you're not having a full range of experience, rather than approaching it as like, this is another being outside of myself. And whether or not it's a person or a tree, it's something outside of yourself that you can't really fathom, but you also exist in the same space with it. So she's kind of like, to get the full range of experience, you should, or you might want to appreciate others with this I thou relationship rather than the I it, I think is the contrast to that.
Yeah, I'm curious if anyone else like picked up on, even though like we all seem to agree that there's nothing super clear cut and prescriptive at the end of this book, like no bullet points on like how to change your life or whatever, but there seems to be a subtext like running throughout this book for me that, in order to not think of other people as just like, puppets or whatever, like inputs in your grand scheme, or just, I don't know, uninteresting. It does require an overhaul of the self and really like kind of taking stock of who you are, and that's why the detaching is important, and that's why that practice, that willful practice, is so important. It reminds me of a book I'm trying to read by Tara Brach called Radical Compassion, and it is all she sets it up in 3 parts, and the last part is like, how do you relate to others? And like the first 2 parts very much have to do with what are you trying to do inside yourself within. So I think that is a suggestion that one ought to start there.
One of the writers she mentions is actually someone again, I'm referring to my class a lot because this is a topic of interest to me, but she talks about Mike Irwin and his arguments around solitude. And some of the things that he talks about is that solitude helps us define and connect to our values and principles, right? And direct from within, which is, I think, what you're describing right now, Lauren, is that by going through this space of pausing and observing and being aware, we start to identify who we are, whether within the system or who we want to be, like what is important to us. And then from there, we can do that reframe and re-engage with the world.
So that person again is Mike Irwin. Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Yes, Irwin.
Well, we are right about at the hour, and I think that's a good stepping off point to give us stuff to continue to think about, which I think this book, personally for me, will definitely keep providing me with things that I want to think about and things that I want to engage with. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this conversation. It's been really, really interesting.
Yeah. And thank you all for supporting Unerased Book Club. And I hope that you'll join us next year. Our 2022 reading list is now available on our website, unerasedbookclub.com. And our January read will be Anti-Men, a hybrid memoir by Rajiv Mohabir. He is a Guyanese Indian author, American author. He writes and a queer person, and he writes about identity and cultural memory and things of that nature. So really love that book. So I'm excited to talk about it with you all next year.
Great.
Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.